You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Okay, so true story, I was scared to try tampons because I didn't know if they'd be able to protect like pads. Took me a few tries, but once inserted properly, tampons shouldn't hurt. If you feel it, it's not in far enough. Believe me, it changed my life. Like pads, tampons offer up to 100% leak-free protection, whether you're on the go or chilling at home. Now, I do and wear whatever I want on my period, thanks to the freedom and flexibility I get with adding Tampax to my routine. Learn more at Tampax.com.
Who doesn't love getting something for free? Labor Day deals have arrived at the Home Depot, and right now you can get a free Milwaukee 18-volt extended capacity battery, $159 value, when you buy a select tool. Get longer runtime and more battery life so you can power all your fall projects. Shop Labor Day deals and get a free battery when you buy a select tool at the Home Depot. How doers get more done. Limit 1 per transaction. Exclusions apply. Full eligible tool list in store and online.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 194, The Fall of France, Boulogne, Calais, and the Halt Order. This week, a big thank you goes out to Joseph, James, Grace, Pat, Kyle, and another James for choosing to support the podcast by becoming members. They now get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes and special member-only episodes once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. On a programming note, next week's episode will be the last normal episode for a few weeks. I'll be taking a trip across the pond to the UK and France for a few weeks, and so you'll be hearing a few interviews throughout September. The normal episodes will resume in the first week of October. In related news, I'm taking restaurant recommendations, which you can send my way over to the podcast email or through social media, for Eastern London and Reims in France, as I will be in both cities for a few days. And if any of my listeners have any control over the weather in England, good weather on September 14th would be greatly appreciated, as I'll be at the Battle of Britain Air Show at IWM Duxford on that day. So I would love some really nice weather. But that's enough about me. Let's get on to the episode. While there was a British expeditionary force on the continent, the Channel ports would always be important, as they were the path of supplies for the British troops while they were in France. After the German forces had reached the Channel at Abbeville, and then the counterattacks against the German corridor on May 21st had failed, the remaining ports that had access to the Allied pocket in Belgium became not just important, but critical to the continuation and the continuing existence of all the divisions trapped on the northern side of the corridor. Initially, there were 3 major ports, Boulogne, Calais, and Dunkirk, and the Germans were fully aware of their importance. All 3 of them were priority targets for the panzer forces of Panzer Group Kleist, with Guderian's 1st, 2nd, and 10th Panzer Divisions all targeting a different port. Boulogne would fall in just a few days, Calais would hold out a little while longer, and Dunkirk is of course a much bigger story. This episode begins at Boulogne, where the British 20th Guards Brigade, a bit over 1,400 men in all, under the command of Brigadier Fox Pitt, would begin to disembark from their ships that had brought them from Britain on May 22nd. The Guards were just one of the forces sent by the British government to Boulogne and Calais out of concern that the Germans were going to quickly capture the 2 port cities and then advance further along the coast to completely separate the BEF from the sea, a situation that would inevitably lead to disaster. These British reinforcements would add to the defense of Boulogne, which was already defended by a few elements of the French 21st Infantry Division. More French forces were on their way, but their train had been delayed, and so they wouldn't be there at the beginning of the fighting. The delay was already a major problem, and it would have been an even bigger one, except for the actions of a few soldiers of the French 21st Division's 48th Regiment. Late in the morning of May 22nd, the German forces were approaching the village of Neufchâtel, to the south of Boulogne. The good news was that the French had positioned 4 75mm and 4 25mm guns in this area, which was near the headquarters of the 48th Regiment. The bad news was that very few of the actual infantry units of the 48th Regiment had arrived, and therefore the only way that the gunners could be supported was by bringing together the headquarters staff of the 48th. This meant that instead of trained infantrymen, the guns would be supported by drivers, secretaries, and other administrative staff that were brought together and positioned around a critical crossroads where they would wait for the Germans to arrive. This thrown-together force would at least slow the German advance down, and after the Germans had lost 2 tanks, they were forced to take the time to outflank and disable the anti-tank guns before they could continue. However, it was always going to be about slowing and not stopping the German attack, and so the French efforts would, in many ways, be a complete success. Then, as the German tanks continued north, 2 German tanks would be disabled by another French anti-tank gun, with the gun apparently firing until the very moment that the German tanks were at point-blank range, a testament to the bravery of the French gunner. But by the early morning hours of May 23rd, the Germans were ready to launch their attack on Boulogne itself, and as soon as the troops of the 2nd Panzer began their attack, Fox, Pitt, and the French forces in the area were forced to fall back. They would be able to hold on for the day of May 23rd, but then during the night, the British forces called in the Royal Navy to evacuate as many troops as possible, leaving only a few hundred behind. There was a problem, though. The French general who was the commander of French forces in Boulogne had not been informed that the British troops were being evacuated. When he found out about it, he was, but quite reasonably, very angry, and openly talked about a British betrayal. Even though they were heavily outnumbered, the French and remaining British forces would continue to fight on over the following day, during which Boulogne would be the scene of brutal house-to-house fighting as the Germans slowly pushed the defenders back. The French garrison would hold out until the morning of May 25th, at which point they would surrender. It was the first of the 3 Channel ports to fall, and the evacuation of the British forces on the night of May 23rd would be one of the strongest pieces of ammunition used by anti-British French leaders in the days that followed. After the fall of Boulogne, all eyes shifted to Calais and Dunkirk on the Allied side, while on the German side, well, they were having more chats about what they should be doing. Over the course of this entire series, we've been tracking the pauses enforced on the German armored divisions by German High Command. The first of these would occur on the 17th of May, then on the 21st as well. And in both cases, the pauses were for about 24 hours and were put in place when concerns about possible Allied actions grew to a point where there was a concern that the divisions at the front would be cut off before the slower infantry divisions could arrive on the scene. In both cases, there were strong opinions on both sides, and the decisions get some light criticism from historians, but nothing compares to the criticism leveled against the German leaders who supported the 3rd major halt order on May 24th, which is often referred to as the Dunkirk halt order. Conversations about this new halt order really got rolling on the evening of May 23rd, and it originated at the headquarters of von Rundstedt. The idea seems to have originated from conversations between Rundstedt and the commander of the 4th Army, von Kluge. The order that was to be given was very similar to the previous pauses, with the plan being for those divisions at the front to pause for 24 hours while infantry forces continued marching, with the hope that they would be able to close up or aufschlieben during that time. The only German forces that would continue their attacks the next day would be 2 infantry corps around Arras, which were pushing back the British forces that had attacked in that region over the previous days. The duration of this new pause was very clearly set to be just another 24 hours, and the panzer groups under Kleist and Hoth were told to prepare to continue their attacks on the 25th of May. It is at this point that the new situation on the night of May 23rd began to diverge from the earlier instances where these pause orders were sent out. When news arrived at German High Command of the orders that von Rundstedt had given, they were very concerned. Both Halder and Brosich, the commander-in-chief of the army, began to intervene in the situation. Instead of overruling Rundstedt's orders, which would have been a very heavy-handed thing to do and might have even resulted in his resignation, Brosich instead wanted to remove 4th Army from Army Group A, which meant that von Rundstedt would no longer have any armored divisions under his command. This is because just a few days earlier, there had been kind of a reorganization of armored forces under von Rundstedt, and so all of the German armored divisions under his command had been placed inside of the 4th Army, which was a little different than how it was at the beginning of the invasion, but that's really just administrative until this moment, when it became a threat to remove all of these forces from his command. The 4th Army would instead be moved under Army Group B, commanded by General von Bock, which had started the war attacking through the Netherlands and Belgium. Bock had a very different view of the situation when compared to Rundstedt, and those views could not have been more different when it came to the possibility of an Allied counterattack. I think there are two quotes that do a good job of illustrating this. So let's start with a report from Rundstedt's Army Group A on the 25th of May. It would state, quote, "One cannot rule out the possibility that the enemy is conducting his movements according to a uniform plan with the intention of breaking through the Fourth Army and its subordinate mobile troops by attacking from north and from south in order thus to restore contact between the separated army elements," end quote. And that quote is essentially talking about all of the French and British counterattack plans, including Weygand's plan, which was technically still planned to occur on the 25th. While at the same time, Bach, the commander of Army Group B, would write in his diary at roughly the same time on May 25th, quote, "I had no worries of this sort whatsoever. If they were ever at all justified, they have become completely invalid ever since the 18th and 6th Armies got the English by the throat, making them happy just to escape with their lives," end quote. Bach is very close to correct here. By May 25th, the minds of all of the British and French commanders of the trapped divisions inside of Belgium were devoted to how to extract their forces from the growing disaster, not how to launch a major counterattack. That's why Weygand's plan for this massive counterattack never actually happened. They were just trying to keep things together and move closer to the coast. While Brauchitsch wanted to move the Fourth Army over to Bach, for reasons that seem pretty clear based on the opinions of the two army group commanders, Halder was concerned that making such a move so late in the campaign could cause problems. And Halder in this case was correct, but mostly because Hitler was about to get involved. The problem started when Hitler arrived at Rundstedt's headquarters on May 24th to discuss the situation and his plans to continue the attack. When he arrived, Hitler learned that Rundstedt had been ordered to hand over the Fourth Army to Bach. Hitler then did, well, Hitler things, and immediately declared the orders for the Fourth Army to be null and void, and that they should be completely ignored, and they should remain under Rundstedt's command. He made this decision at least partly because Rundstedt's thoughts on the situation at the front were very similar to Hitler's own, with Hitler having been concerned about a possible Allied counterattack for several days. Later on the 24th, Hitler would issue his specific orders for where the forces around Dunkirk and around the coast should halt, with the important part being that the troops to the east of Dunkirk, which were part of Army Group B, could continue their advance, and at the same time the infantry corps around Arras could also continue, but all of the mobile divisions to the west of Dunkirk, that is, the Fourth Army under von Rundstedt, had to stop their advance immediately. This new order really just meant that the previously desired halt was to continue into the next day, even though it was originally supposed to only be in force on May 24th. Importantly, and this is another example of Hitler really just causing problems, he would also make it clear that he gave Rundstedt the full power to decide when to continue the attack. This gave Rundstedt a tremendous amount of power, and with Hitler's backing, he could basically ignore any orders that he did not like from German high command, a power that he would quickly take advantage of. Brauchitsch and Halder would try and get around the halt order by giving some directions to army groups A and B, which used the very specific terms the go-ahead is given instead of using the word ordered to try and get around any weird problems, but it's kind of a silly word game. And Rundstedt simply refused to pass on the orders to his troops, ending any chance of some kind of creative circumvention of Hitler's halt order. This is a great instance of Hitler's direct support for Rundstedt kind of already causing problems, because in a military situation, you can't just refuse to pass on an order from your commanding officer, which is what Rundstedt was doing here. But, well, he had Hitler's support, and he was his commander's commander, I guess, so it worked out. Then something happened. The halt order continued, not just on the 24th and then into the 25th, but then on to the 26th as well. And in fact, things would not resume until early on the 27th. In some ways, it seems like Rundstedt, having the backing of Hitler, prolonged the halt order longer than he originally planned, just to kind of prove a point. When the attack did resume on the 27th, the situation around Dunkirk had completely changed, for reasons that we will discuss next episode. And instead of it being lightly held, the British and French had spent the previous 2 days frantically moving troops into defensive positions around the city. This meant that when the German attacks restarted, they quickly bogged down due to the resistance that they faced, and it would take many more days before Dunkirk would be captured, during which the evacuation of troops from the port would continue. Looking back now, the halt order on the 24th was the second time that the advance towards Dunkirk had paused, possibly preventing the Germans from capturing it before any evacuations could take place. It is worth noting, though, that the capture of Dunkirk was not certain on the 24th. The German armored forces, particularly those of Guderian, were once again stretched very thin, with large portions of Guderian's artillery still tied up in the attacks on Boulogne and Calais. So it's possible that they may not have been able to reach Dunkirk, and they would have been stopped by French and British resistance. However, it is worth noting that some of the criticism of the extended halt order also comes from after the campaign, particularly in later writings by Guderian, because critically, the German leaders on May 23rd and May 24th and May 25th did not know that the British were going to stage this massive evacuation and the impact that such an evacuation would have on the course of the war. That understanding would only come later, after Operation Dynamo had completed. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Are there things you would love to learn, but as an adult, it's hard to make time to learn new things? Sometimes it feels like the desire, the ability, gets lost in childhood. Therapy can help you reconnect with your sense of wonder and rediscover your curiosity. Any time is the best time to start your back-to-school era, and that is where BetterHelp comes in. BetterHelp is entirely online, so you can do it from the coziness of your own home, or anywhere else you want to, for that matter. And to get started, all you have to do is fill out a questionnaire which will help match you with a licensed therapist. It's easy, convenient, flexible, and it removes as many barriers as possible between you and therapy. So if you're thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. Rediscover your curiosity with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/WWII to get 10% off of your first order. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/WWII.
The last thing you want to hear when you need your auto insurance most is,
"Thank you for calling. Please listen to your list of 46 possible service options."
which is why when you choose USAA Auto Insurance, you'll get great service that is easy and reliable. 24/7 online service for claims, access to roadside assistance, and more, all at the touch of a button. Start getting the service you deserve. Get a quote today. Ability to receive a quote depends on membership eligibility. Membership eligibility and product restrictions apply and are subject to change. USAA means United Services Automobile Association and its affiliate, San Antonio, Texas.
While all the conversations and orders and counter-orders and Hitler needing to be involved was happening among the German military leaders, at the port of Calais, the fighting would continue. Calais would receive British reinforcement, just like Boulogne, with Brigadier Nicholson's 30th Motor Brigade arriving on May 22nd. They would join the forces that were already in Calais, which had a larger than normal garrison because during the campaign, it was the largest port of supply for the BEF, with particularly a stockpile of rations in the city, which was quite large, which was quite important because, of course, the BEF needed to eat. Another 2 battalions of British reinforcements arrived on May 23rd to increase the size of the defending forces, which allowed Nicholson to set up 2 defensive lines. The first was simply a screen to slow the advance, but then an outer perimeter was put in place based on a ring of 19th century fortifications. These defenses were mostly manned and ready when the German forces arrived outside the city on May 23rd. As the German pressure mounted around Calais, Nicholson gave the decision to begin to collapse back to an inner perimeter that had been mapped out when the British had arrived, and this helped to drastically reduce the amount of territory that the British troops were trying to defend, which of course also drastically reduced the length of the front, which was good because they were outnumbered. At 3 a.m. on May 24th, Nicholson received a message from the War Office, which indicated that his troops would at some point in the near future be evacuated, with the exact message saying, quote, "Evacuation decided in principle. When you have finished unloading your motor transport ships, commence embarkation of all personnel except fighting personnel who will remain to cover final evacuation," end quote. Then at 6 a.m. on the 24th, just a few hours later, Nicholson would be able to communicate with the War Office via telephone, and during the conversation, he was told that the evacuation probably would not occur for at least 24 hours, but it was still the plan to evacuate them. The belief that evacuation would occur would continue throughout most of the day on the 24th, as the fighting continued throughout the inner perimeter that had been established. However, back in London, the decision to evacuate Calais would be reversed on the 24th, and this information would be given to Nicholson very late in the day. There were two primary reasons for this change in policy, which would result in the eventual death or capture of all the British forces in Calais. The first was due to the belief that the continued resistance at Calais would play an important role in slowing the German advance towards Dunkirk. The British were focused on evacuating as many troops as possible from Dunkirk, and so any delay of German forces moving that direction was incredibly valuable. The minutes from a meeting of the British War Cabinet would spell this out quite clearly, with the minutes document from a meeting on the 25th stating that, quote, "It was essential to hold on to Calais for as long as possible. If we attempted to withdraw our garrison from Calais, the German troops in Calais would immediately march on Dunkirk. A message should be sent to our troops in Calais telling them that every hour that they could hold out would be of immeasurable value to the British Army," end quote. The second primary reason for the continued defense of Calais were the actions of the French. Around the same time that Nicholson received the information early on May 24th that his forces were to be evacuated, this information was also passed to the commander of the French troops in Calais, Commandant Leterrier. He would then telephone General Fagel, who had been put in command of all of the French forces that were defending all of the Channel ports. Fagel did not believe that the ports should be evacuated by anyone, and that the fighting should continue as long as possible, and that the British, especially, should continue fighting whether they liked it or not. These concerns were moved up the chain of French command, resulting in political pressure on the British not to once again abandon the French defenders of another city, just like as it happened at Boulogne. Looking back, the reasons that the British forces were left at Calais are important because they help us understand the course of the campaign as a whole. But for the men who were left to fight on, the reason that they were still there didn't really matter that much. Early on May 25th, there would be an attempt by the Germans to arrange a surrender, but Nicholson would reply that, quote, "The answer is no, as it is the British Army's duty to fight as well as it is the Germans," end quote. Then at 7:55 p.m. on the 25th, the commander of one unit who had lost contact with Nicholson would communicate directly with officers across the Channel in Dover, and he would say, quote, "From Rifle Brigade, Calais. Citadel, a shambles. Brigadier's fate, unknown. Casualties, Rifle Brigade, may be 60%. Being heavily attacked and flanked, but attempting counterattack. Am attempting to contact the units fighting in the town. Are you sending ships? Quay intact in spite of very severe bombardment," end quote. While the British troops were fighting for their lives, General Schall, the commander of the German assault troops of the 10th Panzer Division, was working under a bit of a compressed timeline, because he was told that if his troops were not making real progress by the afternoon of the 26th, his units would be called off, and the Luftwaffe would be brought in to simply destroy the entire city with bombing. This, fortunately for everybody in Calais, would not happen, and by 2 p.m. the German forces were making their final assaults on the city. For the British and French forces, by the middle of the afternoon on May 26th, the defense was simply falling apart. Orders began to go out in some units that officers and men should try and hide until dark and then stage a breakout, and orders went out that it was every man for himself. News arrived at the Citadel, where the British had set up their headquarters, that the French forces had surrendered at 3 p.m. Lieutenant Evitz, a signalman among the headquarters staff, would record Nicholson's reaction when he was informed of the French surrender. Quote, "The bitter agony of defeat lay unmistakably written on his face. Now he was about to suffer the humiliation of surrender. The French naval liaison officer came again into the fort. This time he went straight to the brigadier and spoke quietly to him. Then Colonel Holland, after a few words with him, came over to me and said, 'The Germans have reached the fort. I want you to go out and take the first 10 men with you. There you will have to surrender.'" And with that, the defense of Calais was over. And with the fall of Boulogne a few days earlier, there was only one Channel port left, Dunkirk. Thank you for listening today, and I hope you will join me next episode, in which we will discuss, or begin discussing, the story of Dunkirk, or the myth of Dunkirk. Story and myth. They're both there.